The air felt heavy in the brigade building at Fort Campbell, as afternoon heat pressed against the windows and the conditioning fought to keep pace. Hallways carried the steady rhythm of boots and clipped voices, a cadence that said work was not optional. Inside the office of the 2nd Brigade Combat Team staff, the atmosphere tightened in a way that needed no words. The door closed, and the room seemed smaller than it had a moment before. Captain Lena Carter stood at attention on the carpet, shoulders square, eyes steady, hands still at her sides. She was 29, a logistics officer who looked like she ran before sunrise and kept her paperwork as tight as her timelines. Her operational camouflage pattern uniform sat clean and flat, pockets closed and name tapes aligned. Her boots were rough out and serviceable, the kind that never took a shine and were never meant to. Her hair was secured in a regulation bun under AR 6701, firm against the back of her head. No loose strands, nothing touching the collar. The shape was neat and symmetrical, held by simple ties and pins, not by styling tricks that would fail in wind or rain. She knew it was compliant before she stepped into the office. She knew it was compliant as she stood beneath the fluorescent lights with the brigade commander watching. Colonel Andrew Blake faced her from behind the desk, jaw set, ribbons in crisp rows. To his left stood Lieutenant Colonel Laura Brooks from the brigade staff, hands folded and eyes lowered. To his right stood Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Price from a subordinate battalion, face still and unreadable. Against the wall, Command Sergeant Major Robert Delgado took in every angle the way senior non-commissioned officers always do. Blake announced that a morning inspection had found a grooming deficiency. He said the standard mattered, then ordered an on-the-spot correction and directed her to remove the patrol cap. Carter moved with calm economy as she lifted the cap, folded it flat, and set it on the desk corner, brim aligned with the edge like it had always belonged there. She reached up and checked what she already knew to be right. Her fingers tested the anchor points and the twist. She adjusted a tie that needed no adjustment. She smoothed hair that did not need smoothing. Her bearing stayed unchanged, the same steady posture she used on a convoy when the radio crackled and the next 5 minutes might ask for everything. The room watched her comply. Brooks shifted her weight and looked at the floor, the way people do when they want to be anywhere else. Price kept still, a statue with a service record. Delgado watched with a patience that did not hide concern. Measuring where standards ended and something more personal began, Blake spoke in a tone that suggested lineage rather than performance had put her there. He framed the moment as accountability, while letting the implication hang that her last name carried extra weight. Carter let the words pass without catching on them. She focused on the mechanics of compliance, because that is how a professional takes heat without giving any back. She checked the bun once more, ensuring no hair crossed the collar line. No pins were visible. No bulk pressed under the cap line. She returned to attention and kept her gaze on a neutral point just over the colonel. Her breathing settled into an easy cadence that did not show the room the energy it was taking to stay quiet. Holding that silence became its own demonstration of control. Delgado noted the difference between enforcing a standard and staging a spectacle. He had seen on-the-spot corrections that were quick, private, and done with respect. This was not that. This was a performance for an audience that included 2 field-grade officers who understood the chain of command well enough to say nothing. The office smelled like coffee and carpet cleaner and a little bit of tension. Air vents hummed somewhere above the ceiling tiles, a thin white noise that felt almost loud. Blake dismissed her in a way that carried finality but not closure. Carter executed a precise facing movement, retrieved the cap, and set it on her head without breaking the line of her posture. She stepped into the hallway where the temperature felt different and the sound of normal work returned. The patrol cap sat square. The bun sat correct, and her stride matched the measured rhythm of the building. She did not look left or right for reaction. She did not need to. In her head, she stacked tasks as if they were supplies on a pallet. Document everything while details were fresh. Comply with every order without letting it touch the core. Let the system work because the system, imperfect as it could be, still had channels and checks that mattered under AR 60020 and the values that supported it. Rumor would travel down the cinderblock hallways and across the motor pool by the next meal period. That was not her concern. Her concern was accuracy, witness names, and the sequence of events as they happened, not as they would be told. Precision would be her shield, and patience would be the way she carried it. She stepped past framed unit photos and campaign streamers and shadow boxes. She kept the same pace she used when leading soldiers who watched more than they listened. The office door clicked shut behind her and was replaced by the buzz of daily work that always finds a way to continue. The moment was over and the consequences had barely begun. In the quiet of her own workspace, she pulled a notebook that had no drama on the cover and started a simple list. Place, personnel, actions, compliance with regulation, demeanor of each actor. The list had no adjectives because it did not need them. Facts were enough when the audience included people who would weigh them without theatrics. She knew this would not resolve overnight. She also knew she could carry the weight because deployment teaches that waiting is a task like any other. The countdown in her mind began. Not a clock on a wall, but a sense for how fast information moves in a headquarters. 72 hours felt like the right measure for a system to notice and respond. She closed the notebook and squared it with the edge of the desk. The patrol cap went to its hook. The uniform stayed the same as it had been all day. A quiet statement that standards are not the enemy. Then she turned back to work. Because work is how a soldier keeps breathing when the room has just tried to take the air. Lena Carter grew up where unit crests lined the walls and cadence floated in with the morning. Fort Bragg shaped her days before it became Fort Liberty. And a base map felt as familiar as a backyard. Her mother died when Lena was young, and the house settled into the quiet rhythm of two people who understood duty. Her father was Colonel Michael Carter, Special Forces, later retired. People spoke of him with the soft respect reserved for those who brought soldiers home. His ribbons included 2 silver stars and a Legion of Merit. But his message at the dinner table was simple and steady. Leadership keeps people alive. Lena liked numbers and systems that worked under stress. West Point accepted her. And she chose systems engineering because clarity felt like a kind of courage. When it came time to pick a branch, she went into logistics after calm advice from those who had watched wars up close. Moving the right things to the right place at the right time saves lives. By 2019, she wore the bars of a captain and led a distribution platoon with 3rd Brigade Combat Team in Iraq. Her job was convoy security and forward resupply. The heartbeat that keeps rifles fed and vehicles moving. The motor pool smelled like diesel and solvent. And her checklist lived in her head even when her hands were full. Her convoys mixed MATVs and up-armored HMMWVs, spaced to blunt a single blast and still support one another. Roof mounts carried M250 caliber machine guns and M240B for flexible suppression. Radios were Singars or Harris, with brevity and call signs drilled until they felt like a second language. Spacing, speed, and angles were decisions made in seconds and measured in lives. Lena rehearsed every movement on dirt lots before the routes turned real. She walked gunners through arcs, rehearsed drivers on pull-through, and checked every headset. She made her platoon practice casualty drills until the motion stopped looking like practice. The point was not perfection. The point was control when things broke loose. Control was tested one afternoon when a VBIED flashed from a side street and detonated 8 meters off the lead truck. The world snapped into a white slap of pressure and dust that tasted like metal. Ears rang, and the radio washed into static and fragments. Training took over anyway. She ordered security in clear, clipped phrases and assigned sectors of fire. Drivers pulled through the kill zone as trained, then braked into a stagger that kept crossfires clean and fields open. A gunner laid short suppression bursts with the M240B to pin likely positions without overstepping. The 50 sat, watch, and hold to respect the houses and keep civilians safe unless the threat demanded more. One soldier was on the ground with a femoral bleed. Lena moved to him with her aid bag already open and her mind running the march sequence from tactical combat casualty care. Massive hemorrhage came first. So she slapped a combat application tourniquet high and tight. twisted until the distal pulse disappeared, and secured the windlass. Airway and breathing came next. Then a quick sweep for anything she could fix in seconds. She directed a casualty collection point behind a wall that cut lines of sight and gave a margin against a second device. On the net, she pushed a concise 9-line medevac, with grid and MGRS, patient precedence, and a temporary HLZ recommendation to the south, where rotor wash would not stir the blast site. She added a clear warning about possible secondary threats. The net answered with acknowledgments that were too calm to be anything but professional. The platoon tightened its perimeter and cut noise to what was necessary. Drivers watched mirrors and windows, while team leaders counted heads and checked gear. A second gunner scanned with optics rather than rounds, holding fire because discipline protects people just as much as armor. The street stayed tense but stable until the bird thumped into view. The casualty lifted off, and the convoy adjusted back into a formation that could move without tripping over itself. Lena ran a quick battle damage assessment, verified comms, and confirmed the route to finish the resupply. The mission continued because that was the point of the rehearsal in the first place. Get hit. Get stable. Keep going. Later, an ODA team leader sent a commendation for planning, timing, and the way her platoon flowed under contact. Lena filed it, thanked her squad leaders, and went back to maintenance and manifests. The praise mattered less than the fact that everyone who could come home still had that chance. Quiet competence was the goal. 3 weeks after the blast, a special operations officer asked her a careful question about her father. He remembered a Baghdad rotation in 2009 when Colonel Michael Carter chose to abort a mission that had turned suspect, and later intelligence confirmed a compromise. He mentioned that a then-captain named Andrew Blake had pushed hard to continue. The officer did not comment on what that difference meant in careers. But Lena understood the weight behind the story. She did not repeat the conversation. She did not carry the past into her briefings or the motor pool. She logged the detail as background noise to a present tense job and focused on tasks that could be measured. Fuel, ammo, manning, comms, route, contingency, and medical were the constants she could control. The lesson from home had never changed. Hard decisions sometimes pull you away from the loudest idea in the room and toward the choice that keeps people breathing. Standards exist to protect, not to serve any single ego. In the end, that belief guided how she trained her soldiers, how she ran convoys, and how she carried her rank when eyes were on her. On long nights, she thought about how systems hold under stress. Engineering taught her that load and failure points tell the truth when words get messy. War taught her that calm is a skill and not a mood. Putting those two ideas together became her way to lead. She never told her platoon to be fearless. She told them to be ready and to respect the checklist because a good checklist makes courage possible. She told them that the right spacing is a shield, that clear radios are a lifeline, and that tourniquets are meant to be tight enough to hurt. She lived those points in front of them until they owned them too. When the deployment ended, she brought home notes on what worked and what needed to change. She brought back habits that stayed useful in garrison as well as on the road. None of it looked flashy on a resume, but it was the kind of foundation that does not buckle when someone else decides to test it. That became the quiet center she would lean on when the test arrived again. The story moved through the brigade before lunch the way diesel fumes drift across a motor pool. A specialist heard it in a hallway and carried it to a table at the DFAC, where soldiers ate fast and listened faster. By the time trays hit the return line, the version had picked up edges it did not start with. In the motor pool, a mechanic repeated the parts that mattered and left out the rest. By early afternoon, everyone in the 2nd Brigade combat team seemed to know that a public on-the-spot correction had happened in the brigade commander's office. Some said the standard was the issue, and some said the person was the target. The details shifted like gravel, but the tone was the same. People felt the line between discipline and spectacle had been crossed. Command Sergeant Major Robert Delgado watched the drift of rumor with a steady face and a busy phone. He had no time for gossip. But he respected the way stories pointed at problems even when the facts were rough. He chose a quiet office and a simple plan. He called Sergeant Major Thomas Avery at Division Headquarters to report an unusual command climate event. Delgado kept the call crisp and inside the lane set by AR 60020. He described what he had seen and what he had heard in terms the Equal Opportunity Channel would recognize. He asked for the right offices to be notified without putting emotion ahead of process. When he ended the call, he felt the weight shift from rumor to record. At Division HQ, the Equal Opportunity Advisor opened a case number and logged key points. The advisor did not chase rumors, but listened for patterns that repeat when people are afraid to speak in uniformed rooms. Within hours, 3 officers submitted anonymous concerns. 2 captains and a major who referenced the brigade climate under Colonel Andrew Blake. They did not claim to know everything, only that what they had seen and heard felt wrong. Major General Evelyn Hart received a short brief that afternoon and asked her Chief of Staff for the complete personnel file of Captain Lena Carter. The request included any flags or command interest notes. The file showed a notify division prior to adverse action flag that existed to prevent bias in either direction and to ensure review before any step that could alter a career. It was not protection. It was a guardrail. General Hart directed the staff judge advocate to begin a preliminary review. The SJA team pulled corridor camera footage outside the brigade commander's office, and time matched it to the inspection window. Still frames captured Carter before entry with hair secured in a bun that did not touch the collar. The team compared images and notes to AR 6701 and recent Alleract updates for female hair standards. The legal review focused on compliance, not personalities. The analysis explained how a compliant hairstyle looks under the regulation and what constitutes a true deficiency. It described how on-the-spot correction works when a violation exists and why public humiliation is not part of any standard. The team prepared a factual summary that could hold up under scrutiny. Interviews began with people who had been present or nearby. Lieutenant Colonel Laura Brooks and Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Price both acknowledged they had not personally confirmed a violation. They also acknowledged that they had remained silent in the room because the commander held the authority and the moment moved fast. Their statements were professional and careful, and they fit a pattern the SJA had seen before. Delgado provided a sworn statement that captured his observations and the exact tone of the interaction. He kept adjectives out and times in, marking sequence and placement like he would in a patrol debrief. His words did not accuse so much as they described. The description was enough. In the background, the building chatter kept rolling. A private told a sergeant that standards were turning into theater. A staff officer told a friend that the regulation was being used as a hammer instead of a guide. None of those sentences made it into the official record. But they explained why people were listening for what came next. The unit felt nervous and alert at the same time. General Hart read the initial legal summary in her office with the blinds half closed. She underlined the parts that tied directly to regulation and ignored the rest. Then she asked for a meeting to be placed on her calendar at 8:00 a.m. the next morning, with the necessary witnesses present and the files on the table. She preferred clean facts and firm procedures. Delgado left his office and walked past the framed photos of former brigade leaders. He thought about the way silence multiplies when good people decide that speaking is not their job. He also thought about the duty of a command sergeant major to keep doors open for the truth to walk through. The system only works when someone turns the handle. He did not celebrate the call he had made, and he did not rehearse speeches. He focused instead on making sure soldiers stayed focused on their tasks and leaders stayed aware of their influence. If the process was allowed to run on rails laid by AR 60020 and the values that back it, then the truth could stand up on its own. That was enough for one long day. The morning light over Fort Campbell was thin and pale when the division headquarters hallway came alive with measured footsteps. At 8:00 a.m., the outer office settled into practiced quiet as folders were placed on a polished table and a carafe steamed beside paper cups. The door opened and the room accepted rank the way a parade field accepts a formation. Everyone knew why they were here. Major General Evelyn Hart stood with stillness that felt like authority learned over years. The Chief of Staff set a binder near her right hand, and the staff judge advocate arranged a thinner stack that held images and notes. Colonel Andrew Blake entered with a posture that tried to be taller than the moment. The room recognized the attempt and did not react. General Hart began with the time and place of the incident and asked for confirmation that the participants and sequence were understood. She framed the issue as a public on-the-spot correction that occurred in the brigade commander's office. She stated that the alleged violation involved AR 6701 grooming standards. She then asked why such a correction was conducted in front of multiple field-grade witnesses. Blake answered by referring to standards and the duty to hold officers accountable. He asserted that an inspection had identified a deficiency and that immediate correction preserved discipline. He noted that example setting begins with details. He suggested that delay would have undermined the message. General Hart listened without interruption and then shifted to a new question about preparation. She asked whether Blake had reviewed the complete personnel file for Captain Lena Carter before taking action that could affect evaluations or career timelines. She named the notified division prior to adverse action flag and asked if he had seen it. The Chief of Staff watched Blake closely while he formed his reply. Blake admitted he had reviewed the standard file but had not seen a flag requiring division-level notification. He stated that his focus had been the morning inspection and basic compliance. He added that he expected officers to meet the regulation without reminders. The words tried to sound firm, but the edges blurred in the air. The staff judge advocate stepped to the table and began a factual brief. The team had obtained corridor camera footage outside the brigade commander's office for the relevant window. Still, frames showed Captain Carter before entry, with hair secured in a bun that did not touch the collar. No loose strands visible, and bulk within limits. The images were compared to AR 6701 text and recent Alaract updates on female hair standards. The SJA described how compliance is assessed in practice. A correct bun maintains a smooth profile, does not interfere with headgear, and remains fixed during normal movement. The advisor noted that, on the spot, correction exists when an actual deficiency is observed and is typically private and proportionate. Public humiliation has no place in regulation or in sound leadership practice. The legal brief then summarized witness statements. Lieutenant Colonel Laura Brooks reported that she did not personally verify a violation and remained silent because the commander had already declared a deficiency. Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Price reported similar observations in silence for the same chain of command reason. Their testimonies were calm and consistent. Command Sergeant Major Robert Delgado provided a sworn statement that detailed the sequence and tone. He described a moment that felt staged rather than corrective. He recorded language that suggested lineage rather than performance had become part of the rationale. His statement avoided adjectives and used times and locations that matched the footage. The SJA concluded that, based on images, notes, and regulation, Captain Carter's hair was compliant with AR 6701 at the time of entry and during the event. The team found no factual basis for a grooming violation. The brief also flagged concern that the correction had been conducted in a public and performative manner. That concern intersected with command climate and potential abuse of authority. General Hart turned the discussion to the implications. She reminded the table that AR 60020 requires leaders to preserve dignity and respect while enforcing standards. She noted that when an officer is targeted for reasons unrelated to performance, the Uniform Code of Military Justice becomes relevant. She named Article 133, Conduct Unbecoming, as a potential finding when authority is used to humiliate. She then addressed the personnel flag. The notified division prior to adverse action entry existed to prevent both favoritism and vendetta. It required senior review before steps that could mark a file or alter a career. The fact that it was bypassed raised a separate failure to follow lawful directives. General Hart laid out two paths. Blake could accept a general officer memorandum of reprimand and request relief from command with retirement to follow. Or he could proceed into a formal AR 156 investigation that would examine abuse of authority, hostile command climate, failure to follow lawful directives, and potential Article 133 violations. She stated that either path would be conducted with fairness and recorded with precision. The Chief of Staff placed another folder on the table that held context that mattered more than gossip. The packet outlined a 2009 Baghdad decision point now preserved in operational records and later intelligence. Colonel Michael Carter had chosen to abort a compromised action that post-mission analysis confirmed would have led to an ambush. A then-captain named Andrew Blake had argued to push through and had received an evaluation note for poor tactical judgment. No one in the room treated that history as a verdict. It was offered as background that explained why words about family names and merit had carried sharp edges. It suggested a motive that could color judgment without the person noticing it. It was one more fact to consider beside footage and regulation. Blake stood as still as he could manage, while the truth settled around him. The story he had told himself about discipline and example did not match the record on the table. He understood that the choice in front of him was not between pride and survival, but between two written outcomes. He also understood that his influence over the brigade had ended the moment facts were confirmed. General Hart repeated the time for his written decision as 8:00 a.m. the next day. She directed that he have no contact with Captain Carter, witnesses, or potential witnesses until the decision was received. She stated that the command would continue daily operations without interruption and that soldiers would see their leaders model calm. The meeting neared its close. The SJA collected exhibits and returned them to labeled folders. The Chief of Staff confirmed that the calendar held space for any next steps. General Hart looked at each person in turn until they met her eyes, and then she nodded. The room felt larger when she did. Outside, the headquarters noise returned with printers and low voices on phones. Inside, the moment had changed shape from allegation to adjudicated fact. A standard had been defended by the same system used to enforce it. That is what a healthy command is supposed to do. As Blake left the building, the hallway framed him with unit history on both sides. He passed photographs of leaders who had balanced discipline with humility and who had taught by example without spectacle. For the first time, he recognized the distance between those frames and his own decision. Recognition came late, but it came clean. General Hart stood at the window and watched the morning widen across the parade field. She believed that standards protect people when they are applied with respect and restraint. She believed that ego turns standards into weapons when leaders forget what they are for. She turned back to her desk and prepared to brief the next issue on the list. In another office, the SJA team finalized the summary and archived the footage. The Chief of Staff drafted a note for the chain about professional corrections and private counsel. The Equal Opportunity Office updated the case file and readied a placeholder for closure. Process moved forward with the quiet confidence that only facts can give. By late morning, the division returned to its rhythm as tasks filled calendars and soldiers moved to training areas. The meeting room sat empty except for the faint smell of coffee and paper. The clock on the wall ticked toward a deadline that would not change. Tomorrow at 8:00 a.m., the last page of this chapter would be signed. The paperwork moved first. Colonel Andrew Blake accepted a general officer memorandum of reprimand and submitted a request for relief from command with retirement to follow. The process moved through offices like a file on rails. Within 10 days, he cleared Fort Campbell and handed in badges and keys without a formation. The brigade adjusted its pace around the vacancy. Staff sections kept meetings on the calendar and line units kept training on the schedule. Soldiers are used to turnover even when the story behind it is loud. Work kept everyone focused on what the mission needed next. Captain Lena Carter returned to duty after 4 days away from the spotlight. Her hair remained in a regulation bun that did not touch the collar and stayed fixed during normal movement in line with AR 6701. Her operational camouflage pattern uniform was neat, and her posture was the same measured calm it had always been. She moved through hallways where salutes felt crisper and eyes held a little more respect. Carter did not change her routine to chase attention. She answered emails, checked status boards, and walked the motor pool with a notepad. She kept conversations short and clear. Her tone stayed professional and steady. 5 weeks later, a new brigade commander arrived with a fresh nameplate on the office door. Colonel Jonathan Pierce assumed command and began with a review of the command climate survey. He pulled performance files for officers eligible for company command. The emphasis stayed on demonstrated results rather than connections. Carter's record sat near the top of that stack for reasons that were easy to defend. Evaluations highlighted steady leadership and clean execution in training and deployment. Senior raters used words like reliable and disciplined. The file made a quiet case that did not need help from rumors. When the brigade published slating decisions, Carter was tapped for company command in the support battalion. The ceremony took place on a cloudless morning outside the battalion headquarters. Flags hung still, and a guidon waited for new hands. Soldiers formed ranks that looked sharp without being stiff. Colonel Pierce spoke briefly about character and standards without humiliation. He framed leadership as protection, not performance. He thanked outgoing leaders and welcomed the incoming one. The message matched what people needed to hear. Bravo Company stood at attention as the change of command orders were read. The guidon moved from one set of hands to another with a clean turn and a steady grip. Carter felt the weight of it without letting it change her face. Authority is a tool and not a trophy. Command Sergeant Major Robert Delgado had shifted to the battalion as the senior enlisted leader. His duties covered the entire formation rather than a single company. He made it clear that discipline would be firm and fair. He also made it clear that dignity was not negotiable. Carter and Delgado set priorities in a meeting that ran on checklists rather than speeches. First came PMCS habits to keep trucks from failing when miles stacked up. Next came convoy SOP refreshers that focused on spacing, communication, and actions on contact. Then came CASEVAC drills that would put a clean 9-line medevac into muscle memory. The company practiced radio checks with Harris and SINGARs and took pride in clear comms. Team leaders verified fills and rehearsed brevity, so reports stayed short and useful. Platoon leaders paced near antennas with notebooks and timing sheets. The goal was simple readiness that showed up under stress. Maintenance sections cleaned tools and staged parts by line item numbers. Drivers logged faults without fear of punishment for a broken bolt. The shop tracked parts flow and pushed back on delays with polite persistence. Boring work kept people safe later. A week into command, a staff sergeant asked Carter about the small scar on her wrist. She told the story as a set of facts from a day in Iraq. A VBIED blast. A rapid shift to security. A tourniquet high and tight. A casualty collection point behind hard cover. And a clear 9 line on the net. She kept the lesson simple and let the results speak. Carter called her father that night after final checks. She laid out a training arc that built from basics to integrated events. She described PMCS enforcement, convoy lanes, and CASEVAC drills that ended with a short hot wash. She added a note that they might request familiarization with CH-47F sling load procedures when the battalion tasking and safety support made sense. Her father listened more than he spoke. He asked a few questions about manning and time on task. He reminded her that maintenance and standards save lives on quiet days and loud ones. She said she understood and meant it. In the company office after lights dimmed, Carter sat with a legal pad and a calendar. She blocked weeks for training and weeks for support to other units. She penciled in counseling sessions for her lieutenants and squad leaders. The plan looked plain and strong. She thought about standards and what they are for. They keep soldiers safe when weather turns and noise rises. They keep leaders honest when ego tries to take control. They give everyone the same starting line. The hallway outside filled with the background noise of a unit finishing another day. A private laughed in a low voice and then caught it as someone walked past. A sergeant first class corrected a report and sent a specialist back to fix a line. Normal life returned to the building, one checklist at a time. Carter stood and felt the quiet pride that comes from work, not headlines. She hung her patrol cap on the hook and checked the board near the door. Convoy briefs, maintenance windows, and comms checks looked small from a distance and large up close. That was how it should be. She stepped into the hall, and a pair of soldiers offered crisp salutes that felt sincere. She returned them and kept moving with the same even stride she had before any of this began. Confidence settled in without noise. The company would follow her because she respected what they respected. Back at her desk, she wrote a final line in the notebook. Standards protect soldiers. Ego breaks units. She closed the cover and turned off the light. Then she walked out to meet the next morning, like a leader who knew what her people needed. Standards protect people, when they are applied with respect and care. That is the thread that runs through every room in a good unit. Rules are not a stage, and they are not a weapon. They are the rails that keep weight from tipping onto those who can least carry it. Leadership is the daily work of guarding dignity while enforcing what must be enforced. The right correction is specific, private when possible, and tied to the regulation and the task. AR 60020 says leaders own command climate. And that means they own how standards feel as well as what they say. People remember how you held them to the line more than the speech that explained it. This story settled on one simple truth. When equal opportunity channels and the staff judge advocate move on facts, a unit remembers why it trusts the system. AR 6701 defines compliance, and UCMJ Article 133 defines the line leaders cannot cross. Those pages are not paperwork. They are guardrails that keep judgment steady when emotions try to take the wheel. Captain Lena Carter walked out of her company office into a hallway of normal noise and easy motion. Soldiers offered clean salutes that felt like the unit exhaling, and she returned them with the same calm posture she carried on long field days. Her next hours were about preparation, not drama. She turned back to the boards that matter when the banner is down and the work is quiet. The training cycle started with PMCS because nothing good happens if trucks fail when miles stack up. Convoy SOP refreshers came next, with spacing that makes sense and actions on contact that live in muscle memory. CASEVAC drills followed and ended in a clear 9-line. Short and right the first time. Radio teams checked fills and calls on Harris or Singars so that reports cut through noise and hit the net clean. Plans on paper reached ahead to a sling load familiarization with CH-47F when the battalion's schedule and safety support made sense. Not everything happens at once, and not everything needs to. But momentum matters. A company moves well when basics are strong and rehearsed. That is where confidence comes from when the unexpected shows up. The message to take home is plain and worth repeating. Standards are here to protect people, not to fuel pride or theater. Leaders do not humiliate to prove a point, because the point gets lost when dignity is broken. Respect held inside a regulation builds trust that lasts longer than any loud moment. If you have a story about leadership that protected dignity and upheld the rule, share the lesson with the community. Keep OPSEC in mind and leave out names, locations, and details that do not belong in public. Focus on what helped the team and how the standard was used the right way. Someone else may need that pattern tomorrow. A unit breathes through routine done well. Calendars fill. Tools get cleaned. Radios check in. And small wins stack into a culture that people can feel. That is the quiet victory this story points to. When leaders honor the book and guard the person, soldiers look at the work ahead and feel ready to move.